All right, so as I was praying there, we are in the fourth and final week of our Baewatch series. Baewatch is kind of playing on Baywatch with an E, Baewatch. And it's been really, really fun. I've had a ton of fun with this series. We did some different stuff. Last week, Laura and I team preached, which was a little bit different for, I think, many of you. It was a different style. We've never, ever done that style at Lift before. We have like two people swapping off at the same time. We've done it before. It was traded off, but it was really special to do with my wife last week. And as I said last week, if that spurred conversation or questions, I'd love to hear about it. Bring your questions, bring your conversations. Let's keep the dialogue going there. But as we've been navigating relationships, we're focused a lot on vision. We're focused a lot on purpose. And, that's not a surprise. As a church, we are constantly asking ourselves the question, why does it matter? Why does anything matter? What's our vision? What's our purpose? What's our mission? You see, because as a church, we believe that God has called us to be a people of purpose, a people of mission, a people of intentionality, a people of joy that is taken out into the world and say, hey, world, there is a joy in the person of Jesus, and you need to know about it. But what I want to explore tonight is, what about conflict in relationships? What about conflict in relationships? What's the vision and what's the purpose of that? How does conflict in relationships shape us, change us? How do we navigate it? And you see, the beauty of this relationship is that while it fits into a series that was predominantly written or designed for people that are dating or engaged or married, or people that are single, or certainly talking about romantic style relationships. Shout out to the single people. We did a really good one on the first week that was pretty much for you. So if you're like, what? Go back to the first week on the series. But we haven't really explored the question of, what about conflict? What do we do in our relationships have strife or tension or difficulty? How do we navigate that? How do we shape that? And what do the scriptures call us to? And I can guarantee you tonight that when I open up and when I start reading the scripture, you're going to be like, A, where's Robin going? And B, there's no way that the scriptures could call me to this, because I think if we take this text seriously, if we take seriously what Peter is saying here, I think it changes the way we see things, changes the way we see conflict. So, 1 Peter chapter 3, I'm going to start reading. You guys can read along. If you're there. Are you there? Say I'm there. No, that's good, that's good. Dan's not there, but he's going to get there. All right, 1 Peter chapter 3. Now, I'll give you guys some context in a sec. In the same way, you wives must accept the authority of your husbands. All right? Then, even if some refuse to obey the good news, your godly lives will speak to them without any words. They will be won over by observing your pure and reverent lives. Don't be concerned about outward beauty or fancy hairstyles, expensive jewelry, or beautiful clothes. You should clothe yourselves instead with a beauty that comes from within, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is so precious to God. This is how the holy women of old made themselves beautiful. They trusted God and accepted the authority of their husbands. For instance, Sarah obeyed her husband Abraham and called him master or Lord. You are her daughters when you do what is right without fear of what your husbands might do. In the same way, you husbands must give honor to your wives. Treat your wife with understanding as you live together. She may be weaker than you are, but she is your equal. Circle the word equal. Partner in God's gift of new life. Treat her as you should, so your prayers will not be hindered. Now, I think most sermons that would preach this text would stop there, but we're going to keep going because I don't think it ends. Peter hasn't finished yet. Finally, all of you should be of one mind. Sympathize with each other. Love each other as brothers and sisters. Be tender-hearted and keep a humble attitude. Don't repay evil for evil. Don't retaliate with insults when people insult you. Instead, pay them back with a blessing. That is what God has called you to do, and He will bless you for it. All right, so I'm glad nobody got out and left the room before I've had a chance to explain what on earth is going on here. So, what's going on here, let me frame a little bit of the context, because we're actually jumping in on Peter's train of thought. So Peter was the Apostle Peter. He wrote this letter, and we're jumping in on his train of thought. You see, sometimes the chapter headings don't really actually get placed in useful places. He actually is continuing a series of thought that he's been communicating to a variety of people about how to navigate conflict and difficulty and persecution in the context of the church in the Roman Empire. So he wrote this letter that went all throughout the empire. It would have been copied and carried around. People would have brought it forth. And as the letter goes out, his goal was to try and instruct a set of different people groups. Hey, this is how you are called to live the cause of Christ in your contexts. And the four distinct groups that he writes to are first slaves, which we didn't read, which is in chapter 2. Second, wives. Third, husbands. And then fourth of all, he writes to all Christians, or to all the believers, kind of regardless of their position in authority. But at the heart of what he's getting at is that conflict and persecution and difficulty. I didn't read this part, but I'm going to give you a bit of a framing so you understand where our text is placed. At the heart of Peter's letter is that difficulty and conflict are actually about something much more than us. You see, conflict is not just about us. Difficulty is not just about us, but actually in the context of difficulty and challenges and persecution, especially relational difficulty, which is the type of difficulty that he's writing to, there is an opportunity for the cause of Jesus to be furthered. You see, this shouldn't surprise you, because we've been talking over and over through this series that everything comes back to the cause of Jesus. And in what Peter is doing here is he's framing difficulty in the cause of Christ. Let me give you two concrete examples of how he's doing that. In verse 3, he says that the purpose of navigating this difficult relationship with a husband is what? So that they would be won over. And when he says won over, what he means is so that they would discover the goodness of Jesus. He goes on shortly after where we finished reading to say, instead, you must worship Christ as Lord of your life. So even in the difficulty, I want you to worship Christ as Lord of your life. And if someone asks you about your hope, so if somebody asks you about why you're worshiping in the context of difficulty, always be ready to explain it. Always be ready to commission and give hope to the world. So the short thing here, the framing that I want to set out is that the way we navigate conflict, the way that we navigate hurt, the way that we navigate difficulty and pain and forgiveness has an impact beyond ourselves to actually impact the cause of Jesus in the world. And that we need to learn to see our conflict and our difficulty, especially relationally, in the broader cause of what Jesus is calling us to. So that said, we're going to go straight into the opening line, which is the most controversial. It's going to be good. All right. In the same way, you wives, must accept the authority of your husbands. It's a good verse. Let me explain. Now, what's going on here? What's Peter writing to here? Let's keep reading just a little bit so we have a bit more context. Then, even if some refuse to obey the good news, your godly lives will speak to them without any words, and they will be won over, observing your pure and reverent lives. Okay, so sometimes when we open up the scriptures, especially a piece of scripture like this, we read it as if it was a piece of scripture that was deposited to us from above on gold tablets, completely devoid of context, and some guy dug it out of the ground and discovered it and was like, oh my gosh, I found the truth. But that's not the way the scriptures were developed. That's not the way that God works. God doesn't work in absence of circumstance. He always works through circumstance. You see, if you open up the scriptures and you read from Genesis right the way through to Revelation, in every case, God is working in the midst of specific people in specific times and in specific places. So the scriptures, as a result, are not a set of abstract edicts on, say, do this or else, but rather they're God working through people like Peter, like Paul, like John, to say, hey, this is what God is calling you to. This is what life looks like in your context. And this is good news for us, because it means that God desires to move in our lives. And that is exactly what happens here. Peter is trying to solve a problem in the church. So when he writes a letter, Peter was a real guy writing a real letter to real churches. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, why did Peter write these words? What was going on that Peter felt that the church needed this specific mandate and correction? And who was he writing to, and why was he writing it? So let's dive into it this evening. So Peter was primarily writing to Christians that were dispersed throughout the Roman Empire. They were kind of a little bit all over the place. And if you look carefully at the opening lines of the first verse, he was specifically addressing this segment to wives of non-believing husbands. So in other words, there was this issue in the church where women were coming to faith much faster than men were coming to faith. There were more wives and women that were believers in Jesus than there were men. And you could surmise a whole number of reasons why this would have been the case. It could have been that there was more to lose for men socially. It could have been the whole debacle with Peter and those around circumcision. I think that was a pretty good deterrent. Glad they cleared that one up. There was this kind of this issue where all of a sudden there was a lot of women or wives who were married to unbelieving husbands. And the question was, how do we navigate, how do we live in this context? Now, you have to understand something. In the Roman world, men were much more dominant in authority and in society than women. They could basically do whatever they want. They had authority. They could even throw their children out if they wanted to. If they wanted to sleep with a prostitute, it was their prerogative. They could do whatever they wanted, unless they were an aristocrat, which we talked about last week. So there was this massive disparity between men on one side and women on the other side, excepting a few circumstances. So out of this disparity, we have women discovering that, oh my gosh, I'm called to purpose and I'm called to goodness and I'm valuable and I'm loved by Jesus and I am more than the person I'm married to. Oh my goodness, this is good news. And you can imagine how this is going to lead to significant questions and social concern, especially for the Romans. As the Romans were looking at Christianity going, oh my goodness, this thing is subversive. This thing is going to undo the kingdom. That's why they started to persecute them. So can you see the picture a little bit here? We have a number of women that have discovered their hope, their purpose, that they actually matter, that they have a calling in Jesus, but they live in a society that doesn't really recognize them. So there's this disparity between how they're viewed according to Jesus and how they're viewed according to their husbands. And if we can remember, Peter's concern in the context of conflict is always that the gospel will go forth. That the gospel will go forth. So what he does in giving this instruction, Peter's heart is coming through here. Peter's heart is that in the context of conflict, defer to the authority of your husbands, not because they're necessarily right, but because in doing so, they will come to Jesus. So you can see here, there's a very narrow and specific bandwidth on this issue of conflict, but it actually is incredibly profound for our lives. You're like, okay, so I'm not married, and if I was, I'm not married to an unbelieving Roman, and even if I was, that was 2,000 years ago, and we live in a gender-neutral society, and it's fantastic, and it's great. How does any of this have to do with me? The answer is in how we navigate conflict. Check out what John Yoder, this is just a final little bit of fun fact and theology for you guys, and then I'm going to get to the real meat. You guys got to listen real carefully here. Listen real carefully. The ability to call upon the subordinate party to accept that subordination. So in other words, the ability to call on the woman to accept the fact that they have to answer to the men is a sign that the party, that the woman, has already been ascribed a worth that is fundamentally different than what any other society would have accorded. So in other words, Peter is actually saying to the woman, you guys matter. And because you matter and because you have calling and because you have significance, I want you to put the cause of Jesus first. I want you to put the cause of Jesus first. Okay, so what does this have to do with you? The answer is one word as it pertains to conflict in relationships. And that one word is humility. The one word is humility. In other words, rightness and being correct and having the right answer is not the foundation of a great relationship. If we want to foster healthy relationships, the ability to be correct and right all the time is not the foundation of what is actually going to produce a healthy relationship. What Peter is saying here is actually quite radical. He's saying that the power in the relationship is found not in power, not in authority. It's actually found in humility. In being able to say, you know what? You're right. It's cool. I trust you. You see, but our immediate response in relationships is to desire the upper hand, right? To say, well, I want to bring my rational, correct approach. I want to have the right answer. I want to make sure things pan out according to what I think. And what Peter is saying here to the woman in the church, he's saying, you know what? Rightness isn't actually going to be the thing that produces the best relationship for you. I mean, we're going to get to the men in a minute because he brings them into it and doesn't let them off the hook. And you see that this is important, especially important to the rational, systematic, reason-driven types in the room. I don't know if anyone's like, that's me. I am the rational one in the relationship. I am totally the rational one in the relationship. Why are you guys laughing at me? It's true that either you're laughing at me because you don't believe me, in which case Laura and I are in big trouble because anyway, just regarding, back on track. All right. Let me tell you a story about what this can look like in practice. A number of years ago, Laura and I were driving through South Africa. Yes, another South Africa, another driving story. I promise I'm not making these ones up. We had a lot of stories. So we were driving. If you ever want to test your relationship and test your humility in your relationship, go on a drive. Go on a road trip. I promise you, if you can survive a road trip, you can survive anything. And we're driving through the mountains in South Africa, and there's like these gorgeous twisty roads. Imagine like Californian roads, but like in a better country. I mean, it was just gorgeous, amazing. And the problem is the roads make me want to drive faster because, you know, they're twisty and they're doing their thing. I'm like, man, this is epic. I'm in my Volkswagen bus, being like, I'm going to boss these roads, driving like I'm in a Ferrari. It was amazing. And Laura's like gripping the sides of the seats, like stressed out. And I'm like, what's up, babe? She's like, can you slow down? I'm like, no, it's good, it's good. 3 hours later, I'm still like, doing our thing. We've already had like a number of near-death experiences, which I think I've shared about on this trip. And eventually, Laura's just like losing it. She's like, Rob, you need to not do 120 in a 60 zone on these like twisty mountain roads. I'm like, whatever, it's Africa. There's no rules. And so she's upset. I'm like, what's the problem? I'm driving. You saying I can't drive right? You don't like my driving? You got a problem with me? And she's like, no, I just don't want to die. I'm like, okay. And I ended up just fighting with her. And I was like, you're wrong. Like, I can totally drive. I got this thing down pat. We didn't die. We're still here. I didn't crash. But I also failed a major relationship test in that moment. See, what I was doing is the desire to be right overrode my desire to love. My desire to be right in the relationship, to be the one with authority, to be the one with power, overrode my desire to actually love Laura. To the point where the poor girl was in tears and begging me to slow down. Eventually, I listened and got the cue. A little bit thick, but I'm getting there. You see, humility paves the way out of conflict in relationships. But when we desire power, when we desire authority, when we desire control, it paves the way into conflict. And if you're like, Robin, this seems like a bit of a stretch, keep reading what Peter's got to say, because man, Jesus is a good role model here. Check it out, verse 22. Christ suffered for our sins once for all time. He never sinned. He never did anything wrong, but he died for sinners to bring you safely home to God. Christ did nothing wrong. He was innocent, and yet he was murdered. But what happens? Now Christ has gone to heaven. He is seated at the place of honor next to God, and all the angels and authorities and powers accept his authority. So the kind of submission, the kind of humility that Christ models for us produces what? It produces resurrection, it produces glory, it produces goodness, and it produces reconciled relationships. You see, humility in the context of relationships paves the way out of conflict. So the first thing I want to draw out tonight as we relate and as we navigate difficulties, that humility paves the way. So having kind of tackled a little bit of this socially charged conversation that Peter's got himself into, I want to keep going to what he says to the husbands. Now, I just want to, before I do that, highlight one thing. Verse 7 says, in the same way. In the same way. In other words, what I just said to the woman applies to the men as well. So let's just put that aside and we'll keep going. In the same way, you husbands must give honor to your wives. You husbands must give honor to your wives. In other words, give honor to them. Speak well of them. Lift them up. Praise them. Honor them with your mouth, with your words, with your actions. See, it's interesting. When we give honor to someone, when we say, hey, you matter. I'm proud of you. You're good at what you're doing. I love you. What does that do? That lifts somebody up, but it also changes the context of a relationship. It changes the context of a relationship because now they know that even if there's conflict happening, you love them. You honor them. You desire to lift them up. I love that line. Honor your wives. Honor them. It's like, do I honor my wife when I'm mad at her? When I'm in conflict with somebody, even if it's not a romantic relationship, if I'm in conflict with, a good one's been my mom, man. My mom and I have some real doozies sometimes. And do I honor her? Do I respect her? First of all, do I let go of the pride issue that we just dealt with? Let's say we dealt with that. But can I honor her? Do I lift her up? See, it's interesting. When we lift somebody up in honor, when we give somebody respect, so many of the insecurities that fuel conflict can be combated. See, conflict is often fueled by insecurity, but when we start to say, hey, I love you and you're awesome and you're great, they're like, well, wait a second. Why am I mad at you again? Because you love me. This is great. You see, honor changes the context of the disagreement. And can we agree that much of our conflict is rooted in insecurity? It's rooted in not being sure where we stand with the other person. Not being sure that we're respected and loved and upheld by them. What Peter is saying here is he's saying, husbands, give your wives confidence. Give them confidence that they are loved by you. Give them confidence that they are valuable. Give them confidence that they matter. I can promise you, if we navigated through our relationships with the desire to make sure that even in the context of a disagreement, people knew that they were loved and that they were built up and that they mattered, man, conflict and the whole insecurities around it get diminished. He goes on in verse 10 to say, if you want to enjoy life and see many happy days, keep your tongue from speaking evil and your lips from telling lies. Part of honoring someone is speaking well of them. The words that we say in conflict, the words that we say in relationships profoundly matter. I'm sure many of you have said things where you're like, really wish I could take that back. I didn't mean it. See, our words matter. They have the ability to speak life or the ability to speak death. My mom is always on my case. She's like, Robin, speak life. I'm like, man, I just hate that. She's like, Rob, that's not speaking life. I'm like, oh, yes, Mom. See, but our words have power in our relationships to change things. The power to build somebody's confidence up or the ability to tear it down. And you see, this is why gossip is so incredibly damaging. Because it doesn't just undermine the relationship in and of itself. It undermines the entire fabric that the relationship is built on. When we go behind someone, we start to dishonor them with our words behind their back. We're not just tearing them down, we're also tearing down the people that we are with. As we speak evil of somebody else, we're tearing down our own credibility, and we're reducing them to the level of the disagreement. You see, the words that we speak of others to other people are profoundly impacting. Keep your tongue from speaking evil. I think sometimes we're like, well, yeah, I'm not gossiping, I'm seeking wise counsel. Yeah, it sure sounds like it. Sure sounds like it. You see, the words that we speak of another person, whether or not we're lifting them up or honor or not, changes how we view them, changes how we relate to them, and usually builds up pride and arrogance in our heart, which makes it real difficult to dig our way out of the conflict. And this is why often in pre-marriage kind of sessions that Laura and I do with people, we highlight the need to not take your disagreement with your spouse to your friends right away. To be like, hey, I had a ding-dong with my wife last week. We got into a bit of a disagreement, and I want to tell you about how much of a jerk she is. That only tears the relationship down. Now, I'm not saying that we sweep things under the rug, but there is a context and a way to navigate conflict without speaking evil, but to say, hey, can we talk about this with someone? Can we bring this to somebody together so that it's fair? Because I honor you and I respect you. I want to make sure that we can navigate our way out of it. But airing your dirty laundry to your friends in frustration is probably not the healthiest way to build your relationships. Just as a note, you should totally check out 1 Thessalonians 5. It's like a parallel passage on this. Note that down. Go read 1 Thessalonians when you get home. Now, there's a flip side to this honor piece before I continue. The flip side is this, that we need to have the capacity to actually receive honor from somebody else. That if we want to navigate our way out of conflict, we need to be able to receive the goodness that people speak of us. I think sometimes in relationship, it's like, but I know you're supposed to honor me, but I don't trust you, so I'm going to distrust your actions. I'm going to distrust your words. And sometimes we need to just receive. When it says husbands, honor your wives, wives need to receive that honor. Or wives, when you honor your husbands need to receive that honor. But sometimes we prefer to hang on to our insecurities than be like, hey, they actually love me. Hey, they actually trust me. Hey, they actually cared for me today. No, they couldn't have meant it. They must have some ulterior motive. It's easier to hang on to that blanket of insecurity than it is to receive the honor. You see, but when our identity is not rooted in what other people think of us at all, but rooted in the person of Jesus, then we're now able to receive honor without it leading to arrogance. See, Peter's whole concern here is that our lives reflect the cause of Jesus, and he's saying, I want you, church, to reflect and point people to Jesus, so build your identity on Jesus. Your identity is not built on what others think of you. So when others build you up, it can be like, yo, thank you. That's great. Let's keep going, verse 7. Treat her as you should, so your prayers will not be hindered. Treat her as you should, so your prayers will not be hindered. Our conflict, the way we treat other people, has effects far, far beyond ourselves. It's not just like, Peter's not just saying, guys, treat as you should so that your prayers cannot be hindered. What he's trying to get at here is, guys, the way you navigate relationship will affect every facet of your lives. The way you navigate conflict, the way you speak of each other, the way you honor each other, the way you walk in humility will affect every other aspect of your lives, most notably your relationship with the Lord. Have you noticed that after a major fight, it's really difficult to pray? I've noticed that in many times, Laura and I will have a disagreement, and then after a disagreement, I can't write sermons. which is not a good thing when you're trying to finish it up Sunday morning. I'm like, not good timing right now. You see, when our relationship with God is profoundly impacted by the conflict in our lives. They're not divorced. Our relationship with God is not just individual. It's found in the context of community. It's found in the context of our lives. God isn't just up there being like, yo, I'm here when you need me. He's saying, I want to be intimately involved. And when our lives are producing conflict, God is grieved. And our prayers are hindered. And that's why Peter's saying here, I want you to see the vision. I want you to see what happens when we allow conflicts to take root, when we allow words of evil to take root, when we allow arrogance to take root. So finally, Peter gives two very concrete things that can help. Two very concrete things, and these are going to be quick. Two concrete things. The first we find here, it says, treat your wife with understanding as you live together. She may be weaker than you, but she is your equal partner in God's gift of life. Sorry, I am on the wrong verse. Totally not even reading the right verse there. Verse 8. Finally, all of you should be of one mind. Sympathize with each other. I love this passage of scripture. I was like, how do I expound on this verse and make it sound like he's saying more than he is? He's not. He's saying, be of one mind. Sympathize with others. Be sympathetic. Be sympathetic. I'm going to tell you a story about buying a house so that you know what it's like to buy a house. Now, buying a house is stressful. When Laura and I bought our house, it was a very stressful experience. I can tell you this. We didn't even know if we were like, how are we moving back to Hamilton? Laura was unemployed. We weren't quite 100% clear why we were moving to Hamilton, other than the fact that we loved this church. But we weren't even sure if we were going to be here long term at that point. I wasn't the official leader. I was just interiming. I mean, it was chaos. And we saw this house on McNabb Street, down by the waterfront, right by Pier 4. And I was like, yo, this is sick. This house is the dopeness. It was dirt cheap. It was amazing. I'm always going to go for the cheaper option if I think it's worth it. It was amazing. I mean, this is sweet. It's going to be fantastic. And Laura, who's, I would say, more of an intuitive thinker than I am. I'm sort of reason-driven. Laura's much more intuition-driven. It's like, Rob, I just don't think this is the house. I just don't think it's the one. I'm like, what do you mean it's not the one? It's cheap. It's got rooms. It's got a garage. I mean, it's fantastic. What's the problem? It didn't have a garage. It didn't even have a backyard, which is why I liked it. No grass. Grass is evil. And I was like, I don't see what the problem is. And we fought about it. We had a little disagreement about it. And eventually I had to realize, you know what? It didn't really matter. I've been learning since the incident with the driving on the roads. It didn't really matter if Laura was right. I had to sympathize with her. I had to be of one heart with her. I realized that I was the one that had to move in this situation. And you know what? No, that wasn't the house for us. About a couple weeks later, we're in a different area in Hamilton, and we see this house, and I'm like, yo, it's amazing. Did I get my story wrong there? I think I mixed up my stories. I just, in my brain, oh my gosh, my story's just train wrecked. It's not even going to make sense anymore. I just conflated the two stories in my head. The first house, I don't even remember. The short of it is, it's the temperature. I don't know. The point stands was that we had. Oh no, it was. Yeah, it does. Okay, we're good. We're back. Laura wasn't cool with that house, and it was fine. On the second house, Laura looked at it, or I looked at it, and I was like, "This is the one. This is the one. This is amazing, and it's cheap, and it's fantastic, and it doesn't have grass. So we're gonna have to put it in, which I don't like, but that's a different story." And I was like, "This is the one." And we were discussing it, and in this case, Laura was the one that had to move and sympathize and be like, "Yeah, you know, maybe my husband is right in this case. Maybe this is the house." And so she did, and we moved, and we bought the house, and it's great. And now we're in Hamilton. This is years ago. You see, the thing with sympathizing in the context of relationships is that it starts from a place of humility that recognizes that it isn't necessarily about being right or wrong, but moving so that we can understand the other person's perspective. See, not everyone sees the world the way you do, and this is the beautiful thing. Relationships are an opportunity for us to move to actually have one heart. The second concrete thing is that of tenderness. Love each other as brothers and sisters. Be tenderhearted and keep a humble attitude. See, it's easy to become dug in when there's conflict in relationships. It's easy to kind of dig our heels in and say, this is not what I'm doing. I'm not moving. I'm not changing. My position is fixed. And the more you argue, the more you become dug in, right? You dig, and our hearts slowly become harder and harder and harder and harder. And so we're not even sure what we're arguing about, but we know that they're wrong for sure. And so Peter says here, be tenderhearted. Be tenderhearted. Keep your heart supple. When you're disagreeing, when you're having conflict, ask yourself, am I just digging my heels in? Am I just having, I want to be right? Or is my heart tender to the other person? Is it soft? Is it supple? And you see, the challenge here is that is scary. Being tenderhearted towards somebody else is a lot scarier, a lot more vulnerable than being hard-hearted. But the beauty is in the context of conflict that being tender, being graceful, when we've framed it in all these other things, man, it opens up opportunity for blessing. So finally tonight, verse 9. Check it out. Don't repay evil for evil. Don't retaliate with insults when people insult you. Instead, pay them back with a blessing. This is what God has called you to do, and he will grant you his blessing. In other words, our response to injustice, our response to conflict, our response to being hurt, our response to not knowing what's going on, our response to hurt in our lives is to speak blessing over people. It's to speak goodness over people, to speak love over people. This is what God has called you to do. Where's the conflict in your life? In your relationships? Maybe there's conflict in a relationship. Maybe it's a romantic relationship. Maybe it's a relationship with a parent. Maybe it's a relationship with a sibling. Peter's words here are clear. Pay them back with a blessing. This is what God has called you to do. See, the response to hurt in our lives is first to check our hearts for humility. Secondly, to speak honorably of the person. Third, to understand and be sympathetic. Fourth, to protect our hearts from hardness. And finally, to speak blessing and words of life and goodness over the situation. This is what God has called you to do, church. Wherever the conflict is in your life, wherever the conflict that you will face, it is an opportunity not for more conflict or not more of the status quo. It is an opportunity for blessing to flow. It is an opportunity for goodness to come out of it. It's an opportunity, and this is incredible, for the actual gospel to be reflected in your life. He goes on, verse 18. Christ suffered for our sins once for all time. He never sinned, but he died for sinners to bring you safely home to God. He suffered physical death, but he was raised to life in the Spirit. See, relationships are hard. Relationships are difficult, but when we approach a relationship with the attitude that says, I'm going to love them and I'm going to cherish them and I'm going to lift them up, even if they hurt me, even if it's difficult, even if it's painful, even if I have to let go of my pride, we are actually reflecting the very life and actions of Jesus. It is a direct reflection of the gospel. This is why Tim Keller says in his book, The Meaning of Marriage, the reason that marriage is so painful and yet so wonderful is because it is a reflection of the gospel, which is painful and wonderful at once. The gospel is this: we are more sinful and flawed in ourselves than we ever dared believe. Yet at the very same time, we are more loved and accepted in Jesus Christ than we ever dared hope. It's a well-known quote, but you see in the context of relationships, what he's saying is your relationships are a reflection of that truth, that even though there's conflict and there's messed upness, it is an opportunity for love to flow, is an opportunity for forgiveness to flow. See, in every facet of our lives, it is an opportunity for the mission of Jesus to go forth. Conflict is about more than just the conflict. It's about the mission of your life. And my question for you tonight is, are you clinging on to a disagreement? Are you clinging on to a conflict where you're saying, I don't want to let this go because I was hurt or because and they're in the wrong. And the crazy thing is that Peter's words here is not about who's right or who's wrong. But can you speak blessing over that person? Can you love them? See, justice belongs to the Lord. When we serve Jesus, our conflicts, our difficulties, we say, Jesus, this is your problem. You need to resolve it because you're the one that sits in the place of authority, and I'm going to trust you. Let's pray tonight, church.